The House of Mystery presents Inside Writing, the radio show where authors discuss their writing process in all genres.
Okay, we're back now. And joining us, as we said earlier, it's Matt Smiley. He's the director-producer of Highway of Tears, and just recently won Best Documentary at the Malibu Film Festival. And so let's start out. Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And how are you doing today?
I feel pretty good today. In general, a little bit under the weather, but with regards to the movie, it's been a couple of months now that we've started screening it at festivals. We've done 3 festivals so far, and we started last March, on March 6th at the TIFF Human Rights Watch Festival in Toronto. And that was it was a great screening. I think we had over 650 people there. Obviously run in conjunction with the Toronto Film Festival and the Human Rights Watch, where they screen 8 movies that all have very strong ties to Human Rights Watch. And then we did a screening also for the families of the victims and the communities and the RCMP over in northern British Columbia, which was well received. And then about 2 weeks ago, I was in Waterloo, just outside of Toronto, for the Zonta Film Festival. And there we won Best of the Festival as well. And that festival, they also helped raise over $25,000 for women's shelters.
Wow.
And then we just had our U.S. premiere on Saturday, December 6th, at the Malibu Film Festival, which was a very, very special evening. We had a nice awards dinner afterwards, and very, very surprised to now do 2 festivals that have prizes that we've won back to back as well.
Well, that's great. That's good to hear. Now, so I come across it by accident, sort of. On the House of Mystery show here, we go over unsolved murder sort of things, or cases that we never really got an answer for. And I caught you and a friend of mine who does a radio show in Minnesota here, Minneapolis, and Darkness Radio, and he was talking about the Highway of Tears, murders and stuff. So, and doing research, I found all sorts of, there's no real action or answer on what's right or what it is. Now, I guess the Highway of Tears is sort of associated with the highways north in BC, Canada, 1697 and 5, and it's an 800-kilometer section of the highway between Prince George and Prince Rupert. Now, it says in the fact sheet that the murders happened between 1969 and 2011. So is that... Now, I've heard different amounts, anywhere from 5 murders to 40. So what can you tell us about that?
It is a very, very complex issue, and then when you look at the exact murders... with regards to just the Highway of Tears, there is a program called the EPANA program, which was set up under the E Division at the RCMP to focus just on 18 cases that they had pinpointed the similar characteristics. But outside of those 18 cases, there's well over 40 missing and murdered documented women. And I can tell you beyond a reasonable doubt that those numbers are probably doubled, if not tripled, in the last couple of years. For the majority, none of those cases are reported, either to the public or the media. So it is a really grave issue. There's definitely one girl that I've followed fairly closely for the last 2 years now, Immaculate Basil, and she went missing 2 summers ago, and she was a cousin of one of the people that I interviewed in the film, so it kind of hit me fairly hard. and they did a little bit of a search and rescue, but didn't find anything, and so still to this day she's missing, and there's really nothing ever mentioned about her in the media either.
Well, let's start with that. Why do you think it's not mentioned in the media? Like, I can see an occasional murder or two. There's a lot going on, so it doesn't, to get the spotlight, it has to stick out. I kind of get that, but this seems like a lot of murders not to mention.
Yeah, I think it's a little disconcerting, and it's true. I think after a certain while, it's like which murders are important, what's the focus. I definitely understand, how the what is newsworthy, what is not newsworthy, but I think with regards to these cases, it's true that the communication, I would say, between the families, or in this case the indigenous population, and the police and or the media outlets isn't strong. So I think when somebody goes missing and they don't have the means, whether it be phone lines or access to media outlets, that these cases go sort of largely forgotten.
So I guess now a lot of these are, and I guess I sort of get the idea that this is like a largely First Nations issue. Is that correct, or am I reading that wrong?
I think you are reading it correct, where first and foremost it is a First Nations indigenous issue, mainly because of the systemic racism over the years, the generational poverty that they've had to deal with, mainly more as a population. But the problem is that it trickles in, and this is something that I focus on fairly pointedly in the documentary, is that because you have within some of these cities a lot of other families from various different socioeconomic backgrounds, that it starts to affect everybody, where people seem to turn a blind eye on the First Nations women going missing or getting murdered, but as soon as a Caucasian girl and or male, because obviously we focused on the females, but there is an issue of the men going missing or being murdered as well. But there is a trickle-in effect, because it seems like it's almost that it's okay that these women are getting taken away.
A lot of them are just going missing. They're not finding the bodies, right? Or some of them they found.
They definitely found some of them, some of the bodies. And yeah, a number of them have gone missing. I know I've heard rumors about the Skeena River, where some of them are. I know the RCMP claims that a lot of them are maybe drowning cases. But yeah, for the majority, just because it's such a vast area, the bodies are usually not found, or by the time that they go look for them, it's probably just too late to have any leads.
So now you said there was men as well. I didn't even realize that. I didn't notice any men victims. But then again, that's maybe the media or kind of what's been reported. How many men of that you do think that were sort of taken?
I mean, the exact number I can't be sure of, because even with the women, we don't have exact numbers. When I started the documentary, it was, and if we talk just Canada-wide, it was over 400. And then and then it went up to 600 when we were just about finishing. And a little bit before screening in March, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police released a report, and then the amount of missing and murdered Aboriginal women across Canada was over 1,400. And then there's some groups that I'm fairly close and affiliated to, among which Gladys Raddick, who was just named one of the top 10 Canadian heroines. She's walked across Canada several times to raise awareness for this. but her numbers tally up to, I think, a little over 3,400. So it is a grave, grave issue when you think that the indigenous population makes up only about 2% of the Canadian population.
Right. So what do you think's going on? And I mean that in a case of now it's mainly the Aboriginal, as you were saying, and that. So and you said it increased now over the last few years. So is that just like, you think there's copycats going on, or do you think that it's still one person or one group that's involved in this?
I definitely am. I'm obviously not a criminologist, but I've spoken to a number of police officers and people from the communities. I think some of the murders is probably people within the community that are aware of it, but maybe afraid to talk about it. I think the scariest part, I don't think, is necessarily copycats. In this case, I think it's more predators by opportunity, which is almost more frightening because they're not, I think, and you would know probably to a certain degree more than I do, but serial killers have a certain pattern. And, aside from some of these, in the cases of the murdered women that have been found, sure, there are some similarities, which is why it brings them all together as far as that EPANA group of 18 girls. But the predators by opportunity, it's just somebody that's driving on the side of the road, sees an opportunity to take advantage of somebody, and obviously through force will be able to do so with somebody in a vulnerable position.
Yeah. It's something we don't really think about in Canada either. It's typically not a high murder rate.
No, not at all. And also for me, growing up, I grew up on the East Coast, but you also never really find out much about the heritage, the First Nations or the Native people, which I've definitely gotten very close to over the last little while. But then you also have a little bit of the trickle effect where, we're on the West Coast now, and actually it was 2 years ago that the RCMP teamed up with Interpol and solved a case from 1974, and that was for Colleen McMillan, and she was linked to a murderer, this guy Bobby Jack Fowler, and he was out of Oregon. Oh. And so he was a transient roofer, from the U.S., and he was going up and working. He worked up in Prince George, but all along Highway 16, which is where he murdered one of the victims, who was a young 16-year-old girl. Obviously, that case, dates back to 1974, and they just solved it 2 years ago. Just shows you the dedication, obviously, that the police having some closure to some of these cases, but there's still a lot of work to do.
Right. Yeah. It's been very.
And by the time they found him, he was dead and thankfully in prison at the time of his death.
Huh. Do you think he did any of the other murders, or do you think that that's not? I guess it's going to be pretty tough.
Definitely, I'm sure they had him linked to, I believe, 2 or 3 other murders, but they didn't have substantial evidence. Judging by his prior histories of arrests, I would not be surprised at all, because I know at the last time he was put in prison, he had locked a girl in his hotel room and was trying to murder her, and she managed to jump out one of the windows, which is how the police ended up tracking him down. So I would take an educated guess that definitely not his only victim.
Yeah, sounds like his style. So
yeah.
Okay, well, let's stop for a quick break. Okay, we're back now, and let's talk a little bit about how did you get the idea for the movie, or like when did it come along for you?
I got the idea. I went to go visit my sister who lives in northern British Columbia, I'm currently in California, but I hadn't seen her in a couple of years, and she had just given birth to my niece. And we went on a camping trip about 30 to 45 minutes outside of Prince George, which is in the north of BC. And we went to this place called Clucas Lake. And it's such a beautiful, beautiful place. So the first thoughts of my mind, just as a filmmaker, is that I wanted to shoot something up there. Mainly, I wanted to stay close to my sister, and it seemed like just such a beautiful area. So I was trying to, at night, we were around a campfire, and I was saying it was so beautiful, and I'd love to shoot any kind of story there. And one of the guys that was sitting around the campfire said, "Well, if, you want stories, there are some pretty scary ones here too." And they were, most of them, tree planters that I was hanging out with, and they had a close connection to one of the victims on the Highway of Tears list, which was Nicole Hoare. And so when I found out about her, because she was a hitchhiker, and she was going to visit her sister, and decided to hitchhike, and she's since been missing. So I started researching her case, and that's where I found out about the Highway of Tears, where it was not just one girl that I noticed was missing, but that there was a major, major pattern as far as in that area. And so the more I started researching, then I started speaking to some of the families, and I realized that doing just a regular film was not at all a possibility, and doing a regular film was not a possibility. And I knew I had to do a documentary, because a lot of these families that I spoke to, I don't want to say they didn't have a voice, because they all have a voice, and I think it was just not being heard.
Right. And so, now, is there anything particular that happens to the bodies that they've discovered? Did they do they all have the same sort of pattern of murder, or have they been abused sexually or cut up, or anything in particular that sticks out?
Definitely with the amount of cases that I researched, and obviously in the doc I don't get into the specifics of how they were murdered, mainly because the main focus of the doc was not necessarily to empower women, but to show the effects of what it does to the family, and not necessarily pinpoint what kind of style the murders were in. But just off the top of my head, in terms of hearing some of these stories, there's instances with shoelaces being used to cut their air passages, or in one of the cases, one of the victims was obviously abused sexually. Many of them have been. And in one particular case, she was dragged behind a truck for at least a mile. So when, their family actually discovered her, there was no possibility to have, to see her. But as far as similarities and stuff, I think that police also keep a fairly tight lid on the similarities between some of the murders, or maybe slightly too graphic to talk about.
Right. So now,
because you,
well, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, but so now on the it's been 45 years since 1969. I guess that's the first murder. So 45 years on a person would make them quite a bit older now.
Yeah.
I mean, 65 maybe, or
yeah.
That's a long time to go. So you think it's just been one person primarily?
As far as one murderer, or is that what you're saying?
Kind of like one. It's just been like one serial killer that's done kind of the majority of these. I mean, there's always other murders thrown in because we don't know, and it's in the same area. But the primary part of these murders, do you think it's just been one person behind it?
No, I think there's several, and I think when you start peeling away the layers, it's obviously not just 18 women; it's over 40 just along those three different stretches of Highway 1695, and 1697 and 5 is they are predators by opportunity. So there's certain people that wouldn't normally do it, but maybe on an off day they'll pick somebody up and abuse them and dispose of their bodies. So I think there was, if we look at, I don't know if you're familiar with the Robert Pickton case.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Sheer number of women that he was capable of luring in and killing is unbelievable. And so I think because the North is not in a city and there's not that much access to even find out exactly how many girls to this date are missing and or murdered, that my guess is that we're going to find out that the numbers are much higher than what we actually think they are. So it's definitely not one killer. And then you look at other cases that I bring up in the film, like there's Judge Ramsey, who was a judge that was sexually abusing young girls as young as 12. And abusing them, to the point of them not being able to see, et cetera, that there's a strong possibility that you never know to what extent his past was.
Right. So now, is there any suspects right now, or that they talk about, or the police have let us know, or?
They do have some, but from what I've seen, I know these cases are fairly stagnant. I know they were getting close to a suspect in one of the cases, which was for Nicole Hoare. There haven't been any arrests or anything specific. And then you have other cases like the Ramona Wilson case, where she was reported missing, and the authorities didn't really react for a while, and then the two ATV drivers found her remains a year later by the Smithers Airport, and her killer still hasn't been found. And this was 20 years ago. They just had, I think, their 20th anniversary because they do a walk every year. And the RCMP has since dropped her case due to lack of leads.
So now that's the RCMP, and I know there's quite a segregation. So what about the First Nations police force themselves? Have they followed up or done anything themselves?
I mean, as far as the First Nations police, they're linked in with the RCMP, so it's all part of that, and I don't think they have the resources at all to investigate any of these cases, especially when you get with regards to criminology. As you know, there's a lot of scientific and specific ways of dealing with the evidence in order to actually solve some of these cases. And I think it's also manpower in terms of getting people on the ground and questioning people.
So you don't think it's going to stop? You think the murders are going to keep on going?
The murders will definitely keep on going, and it happens constantly. A week before we premiered in Toronto, there was a young student from the University of Halifax, and she was doing her thesis on missing and murdered women across Canada. Her name was Loretta Saunders, and about a week before we premiered, she was found murdered in a hockey bag off the side of the highway.
Wow.
And they've actually since caught her murderers. I mean, I guess still innocent until proven guilty. But their trial is coming up So, I think these cases, and I think it's human nature that they will continue. But I think what I've noticed, definitely with the documentary and with the awareness that's started to build, is that people are a little bit more vigilant, and hopefully there's more resources to try to protect the women. And what I've been, fairly big is pushing for a national inquiry in Canada into the missing and murdered women, and finding a way that we can, at least increase transportation in the area, help out with education, so some of these women won't be caught in situations where they need to hitchhike or aren't educated enough to not get into the car with a stranger that could be lead to a fatal mistake.
Yeah, that would be a good thing. And so is there one case that stuck out in particular for you, or is there one that really bothers you the most?
I wouldn't say that one case in particular bothers me the most, and I've since, I think as far as particular cases, I've heard well into the hundreds as far as family members that have reached out to me afterwards, and not necessarily just along the Highway of Tears. And it would be less so the cases, but more how it affects the families, especially when, in a certain case, when their justice is not served and the killers aren't found, or that their daughters or sisters or mothers are not found. There's this huge gap or black hole, in their hearts, that it's very hard to hear their stories.
Yeah, it's pretty unresolved, I guess.
Mm-hmm. But it's it's always disconcerting to hear stories of extreme violence happening to girls as young as 11, 12, 13, 14. No matter what the age, it's obviously horrible. But to think, also these very, very young, innocent girls. And I know in the media, they try to say that many of these women are high-risk individuals, like either prostitutes or drug addicts or, abusers of alcohol. But they're still, somebody's daughter or sister. And in this case, when you're talking about 12-year-olds, they're just young individuals that need support from the community if they don't get it from their parents.
Yeah. Well, it's a tough one. I mean, they can be high risk, as in the sense of being out there, doing whatever they do, but doesn't mean they should be murdered, or anything like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
So now, do you think there's is it like sort of a systemic racism kind of from this involved, or is it just a lack of finance, or what do you think
There's two things. Number one, systemic racism is 100% on target and true. There is systemic racism. I've seen it in the cases. I've tried myself to push certain cases along that I've found out about through the course of it. And obviously, like I'm a filmmaker. It's not something that I would want to get involved in. But for the when I start dealing with some of the families and they don't get answers, I definitely try to push certain ones. But I think there is a level, and now that I've been closer to it, I think racism always goes two ways. And I think it's on both ends. And also with regards to solving these cases, or more where my focus is on the prevention, is that it needs to go both ways, where everybody needs to work together in order to achieve results and find. There was the Wally Opal investigation, which looked into the Picton murders and what the Vancouver police could have done better to protect the women. Right. And then also in 2006 there was the Highway of Tears symposium, which they came up with 33 recommendations, including, obviously increased bus service, health care, et cetera, et cetera. All those things will definitely help, but if various organizations are kind of going against each other, then I don't think very much will get accomplished.
Right. So tell us a little bit about the documentary film that you've made. What kind of area do you cover in it?
I cover. I definitely dive deep into. We talk about the residential schools, which is one of the first mandates of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police was to take the young Indigenous children away from their communities and put them into schools, where the Canadian government has now acknowledged that they were, in many cases, severely abused, malfed, and beaten, which leads to, generations of poverty, and also, in some cases, mental abuse. And then I focused a lot on some very powerful First Nations women, and not necessarily. I definitely dive into a few cases to give an overview of the issue of what's happening. A few of the First Nations cases and a couple of the Caucasian families and how they had to deal with it and how they're affected. And I think what becomes very clear is that everybody's affected the same way, but the way that they are supported is usually very different.
Right.
And I hope changing.
Okay. So now, is there any way a person can see your film now, or how's it being distributed?
Well, we just literally started our film festival circuit, so we're to tour around. I'm not 100% sure where our next screening is, but I know we have 2 or 3 that are coming up in Canada. I know in Seattle we definitely have plans to screen it in the next little bit, but we're going to be releasing, I think, 37 cities throughout Canada and the U.S. and also in Europe in the next couple of weeks. So now that we definitely have traction, we're in the midst of signing with a distributor to help us actually get it out to people.
Right. Okay, so now how do people get a hold of you? And let's give your contact information.
The best way to get in touch with me is also through the Highway of Tears website, and it's www.highwayoftearsfilm.com, and there is a contact info page, and the emails go directly to me and our other team members, and we're all pretty responsive, and which is usually the best way to get in touch with us.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you very much for joining us, and good luck with the future and with your film.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
Okay.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of the Z-Talk Radio Network.
I'll be back.